Today we're going to talk all about mixing. I'm going to show you the reason why I put certain instruments and elements down the center of the mix, to the left or to the right, and why it makes for even better mixes.
True Sound Studios is in your ears.
Hey guys, what is up? It is Weezna. As always, we are here at my studio, True Sound Studios, and today we are gonna get into mixing. So the diagram we're gonna be using in this video, you guys are more than welcome to screenshot it, take a picture of it, and use it in your own mixes. So one thing I do have to mention before we get into this video is this is just a general rule that I use when it comes to mixing. Now, this is not going to work for every song in every different genre, but for the most part, I use these methods in hip hop, EDM, pop, rock tracks, anything with real drums, real bass, and real guitar. Okay, so let's get into how I mix these tracks. Okay, so let's get into the way that I mix. For me, there's 5 main areas to be able to put instruments. So first, we're going to start off with left. So this would be 100% all the way to the left. And then next would be somewhere in between left and center. So somewhere right around that 50% area. So that'd be my mix area number 2. My third area is dead center. So right down the center, center pan, 0% left, 0% right. And that is the third area. Now the fourth area would be between center and the right. So once again, right around 50%. And then finally, the fifth area is all the way right, or 100% panned all the way to the right. So obviously there's about 100 different positions from right to center, and then another 100 different positions from center to left. But really the way I like to think about it, especially in modern day music with such dense, powerful mixes, is it's really tough, at least in my ears, to hear the difference between 40% left, 50% left, and 60% left. Those 5 main fields is really what we're going to be talking about. So let's first start with the center. So this is what I typically put in the center of my mix. Now, I would say about 99% of the time, this is what I do. Obviously, there's always situations where things change. Okay, so the things I put down the center every single time is going to be the kick drum, the snare drum, the bass, and the main vocal. Okay, so let's talk about all these individual elements. So the kick drum. Now, my main kick drum, whether it be a mic'd up kick drum, it's a kick sample, the main beef of it, the main substance of this kick sound is down the center. Now, sure, I might put some sort of room effect or maybe some sort of reverb on this or delay that would cause it to be in stereo, but the core of the kick drum is still going to be down the center. The effects, the room sound is really just helping add to the mood of the kick drum, but it's not changing the fact that it's right down the center. So same thing for snare drum. The snare drum, the raw top and bottom snare sound or the snare sample is always down the center. So yes, once again, if I put some sort of reverb, it's almost 100% always stereo reverb. And yes, it helps spread out this snare drum. But once again, the snare drum straight down the center. Now, if we get into other things besides these elements, claps, maybe if you want to add a clap on top of your snare drum, yes, sometimes I will put something like that, maybe between that 50% left and 50% right, somewhere around here. But generally something like the clap is something to help reinforce something else. Maybe the snare drum doesn't sound big enough, even with the room sounds and the reverb. And so therefore I added somewhat of a stereo clap to help fill up some of the space. Now, this would only be in the situation maybe where this track is very simple. Maybe there's just a bass, kick, snare, vocal, and a lead in the track, and I'm really just trying to create some stereo width. Okay, so now let's get into the bass. Now, the reason why it is really important to put the bass down the center is low frequencies, which a bass would have. These low frequencies tend to be the things that go out of phase the easiest and can really affect your mix. Now, because the kick drum and bass are generally the 2 lowest instruments in your mix, maybe somewhere between 20 hertz and maybe 120, these 2 need to really play together well. So the bass and the kick drum need to work together. Now, the problem with making a bass in stereo, a really wide bass, is generally what an effect would do to make a bass in stereo is to take the right channel and it would leave it alone, but the left channel, they would invert the phase. So now we have essentially phasing problems between the left and the right speakers on our bass. Now, this doesn't always happen, and obviously there's ways to work around this, but in the most case, to get a really powerful center punchy mix, I really find that in almost any genre, having the kick, the snare, and the bass straight down the center really makes for the most impact on your track. So now let's talk about vocals. So the main vocal, in my opinion, should always be down the center. Everything else should accompany it. It should work all the way around this. Now, the reason why the vocal works so well down the center is if you use this format, you got the kick drum, which is fairly low. You got the snare drum, which generally a lot of the beef of the snare drum is somewhere between 250 hertz and maybe 300 or 400 hertz. So that's not going to affect our vocal. The bass, once again, a very low instrument. Even if you add some mids to it, the majority of the frequency is going to be in the, below 150 hertz. And therefore, having the vocal down the center leaves us this huge open space to really be able to make our vocal cut through the mix really well. Now, once again, if we get into vocal effects, now this is the reason I like to have vocal effects in stereo, is because this kind of spreads out our vocal to the right speaker and then also to the left speaker. So don't get me wrong, I'm really into producing a lot of pop stuff, and sometimes this main vocal has one track that's about 50% left and the other track's about 50% right, but I still end up finding a ton of things to put down the center to give us that big impact. Okay, so for the most part, that is what I put down the center of the mix. Now, you guys might be asking, what about hi-hats and toms and things like that? For me, these are just the core elements, okay? We're not going to talk about every situation for every different genre. Toms, generally, I will spread them out from left to right just to kind of make it fun sounding. Same thing for hi-hats. Let's say if I have a lead to the very right of the mix, I might put the hi-hats to the left. Often, I find myself putting the hi-hats, once again, right down the center of the mix, but it really depends on the song. Okay, so let's get into some of the other elements that make up our mix. Okay, so this is one of the biggest things that I do on every single track. I feel like this creates the width in the track. So all these elements in white would be the things that are super wide. I'm going to make them as wide as humanly possible. So right here we have chords. So anything that has multiple notes on it when you play it on a keyboard, piano chords, synth chords, pads, just in general, these are generally chord things. So when we talk about synths, whether it be some like super buzzy things or just some really lush sounding, maybe synth strings, generally I try to make these as wide as humanly possible. So as wide left and as wide right as possible. That's why these arrows essentially go to the very edge of our mix window here. So pads, same thing. I really like to keep these super wide. So same thing for strings. Now, whether you're playing individual string parts to make up a big quartet or a big string section or something like that, I generally like to make these very wide because strings, now depending on which octave they're played in, I feel sometimes affects the main vocal in a negative way. It starts taking up, these strings start taking up the space that the main vocal needs to be able to breathe and cut through the mix. And if you guys are into rock music or any music really that just has guitar in it, whether it be acoustic guitar or electric guitar, I really like to take my guitar track. I always double track guitar, and I pan one extremely hard to the left and the other extremely hard to the right. So I have essentially two guitar tracks, one all the way left and one all the way right. So over here where it says stereo at the ends here, these are generally stereo instruments minus the guitar, but because we double track guitar, it essentially turns into a stereo instrument. So strings, you definitely want to pick some stereo sounding strings. Same thing with the pads and the synths, just to make this as wide as humanly possible. So let's get to the next element. Okay, so now we have the leads in blue here. So leads are kind of tricky because it really depends on how many leads are in the song, what part of the song is it, and what other things are going on in the mix that I need to work around. Okay, so if we look at our arrows for the leads here, you can see these are things that we don't typically always go super hard left or super hard right. So for me, I like to mix my leads somewhere between 50 and 60% left and right in my mix. Now, these are almost always in mono. And the reason why is if you take a stereo lead and you pan it to the left or to the right, there's going to be artifacts, there's going to be things that might be happening in the left speaker that you might no longer have anymore because you've panned it almost all the way to the right and vice versa. So having our leads in mono really gets rid of some of those things that can happen with a stereo lead that we might not particularly want. So for example, when I was talking about the hi-hats, let's say I took my lead and I put it around 50 or 60% to the left. Now this might give us a good opportunity because generally the lead is fairly bright to be able to put our hi-hat over to the right-hand side of the mix to kind of balance these two out. So you have the lead somewhere around 50% to the left, and then you have our hi-hats 50% to the right. So the reason why I say it should be set back in the mix by either using reverb or some sort of room sound is because we want to make sure we always leave the main vocal as the focus of the track. Now, if we have our lead dead center down the track and it's really loud, it's generally going to fight our main vocal. And I find this so often, especially when people send me tracks where I have no production input. They have the lead straight down the center of the mix. It's already a stereo mixed down beat. And now we're trying to put vocals on top of it. And I really struggle being able to get that vocal to cut through the mix, which is the reason why we like to pan the leads to the left or to the right, put some reverb or some room sound on it to set it back into the mix so that our vocal is still the main focus of our mix. So the last thing is going to be our backup vocals. Now, backup vocals could be anything from effect vocals to harmony vocals to doubles. It doesn't really matter, but just in general, it's anything but the main vocal. So once again, these backup vocals I like to put in stereo here. So why in stereo? So this is generally during the chorus or the hook of the song, because what I'm trying to do is we have our main vocal that is down the center, and now we want to make the chorus feel really big and really wide. So what we do is we take maybe one harmony and make it about 50% left and right, and then maybe another harmony is 75% left and right, and maybe we have some fun effect vocals that are 100% left and 100% right. And this really creates a really wide vocal sound by really occupying the entire mix with our vocal. So you could do this in a couple different ways. You could either take one vocal and use a stereo doubler to create your right and your left sound by using one single file. So for example, I like to use the waves doubler, and that really helps take a single vocal and make it left and right, and I can control the width of it so that I can accompany my main vocal with some stereo width vocal to make the vocal package, the whole vocal sound, just sound wider. Another thing you could do is very simply track the same vocal and pan one to the left and the other to the right. Now, obviously this takes more time, it takes more work, maybe more vocal tuning, but this is another way to do it. So the only time I don't like to do backup vocals in stereo is maybe during like a verse of a song where we're trying to keep the verse of the song kind of more center focused so that when the chorus comes in, we have this big, wide stereo sound. So for the most part, this is how I mix almost every song. This is really a great way to start out a mix. Now, obviously this isn't going to work in every single song, every single genre, and every single situation. But for the most part, this is what I really like to do when it comes to mixing. So guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you can take this information, learn from it, and make even better mixes. So if you guys like this video, consider subscribing and hit that like button. Follow us on Instagram for daily posts. You can find the beats that I make right here at the studio on our SoundCloud page. True Sound Studios also mixes and masters your tracks. So once again, guys, thanks for watching this video. I'm Weezna. We're at True Sound Studios, and True Sound Studios is in your ears.